Hello again. Now, the continued electricity shortage coupled with geopolitical instability are said to pose the most significant risks to the country over the next decade. This is contained in this year's Global Risk Perception Survey. The country's leading risk and insurance consultants, Riskonet Africa, says risk management policies need to be constantly updated and re-evaluated in order for businesses to survive. Volker von Widdern is Principal of Strategic Risk at Riskonet Africa, is joining us now for more analysis on this. Volker, good afternoon. Welcome to today on eNCA. Thank you very much for your time. I mean, there's been so many risk reports coming out, and I'm sure you are on top of all of them, including the one from the World Economic Forum. Which will be the biggest for South Africa, in addition to the global one that we all hear about since last year of the high cost of living?
Well, the WF report surveys 12,000 specialists around the world, and there is a separate section that deals with South Africa. And there, the theme of the failed state or failed utilities, failed infrastructure comes through very clearly, as well as a debt crisis. So debt crisis would mean something like the government running out of money. So I think those are the key issues that are stronger in the South African context than the top items rated on a global risk basis.
Yeah. So is the first one something akin to state collapse?
Well, it's also infrastructure collapse. So we're busy. Obviously, we know about Eskom, but we also need to repair a lot of our roads, our effluent works, our infrastructure, our bulk water supplies, our railways, our harbors. All of those things go to state infrastructure, and many of those areas are performing below par.
And the question of employment?
That hasn't come through directly in the context of the South African one, but things like geopolitical instability, social instability, and unplanned migration are major issues that have been coming through the reports. Now, we know in South Africa that we have many visitors or migrants from perhaps Zimbabwe or our neighboring states, and we have risks of xenophobia. So we are already experiencing what the World WF report has been talking about as an emerging risk. Obviously, we know about people trying to move from North Africa into Europe, but we've experienced that kind of migration for easily the last 10 or 15 years in South Africa.
Yeah, just on the geopolitical instability, why would that be highlighted? I mean, currently, I'm thinking except for the war, conflict in northern Mozambique, for example, with Cabo Delgado, and South African soldiers are part of that SADC mission there that's assisting the Mozambican government fight against the Islamist insurgents in Cabo Delgado province. If you look geopolitically in Southern Africa, we seem to be a little bit more stable. Where are the red flags?
Correct. I think locally we perhaps have that as one of the key exposures. The reports are referencing obviously the Russia-Ukraine war and also what may happen with China. So yes, we refer to COVID, but China has now quite an authoritarian form of leadership, and their reactions to certain outcomes could be trigger various events that have a knock-on effect on South Africa. China's support also for North Korea is very worrying, and that could have knock-on effects between China, America, and Japan and other areas. So I think we need to look at what that means to us. So if we have to pick sides between perhaps China and America, that may have issues, trade relation issues for us as South Africa in more of a global context.
Yeah, that might not be a problem for us. I mean, we're going to have an American visitor soon on our shows here, and the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and they are trying to woo South Africa not to go anywhere else. But the problem with China as well, would it be the current COVID-19 situation there, which has seemed to be concerning many risk analysts in the West?
Yes, so that's the interesting part about what is apparently the issue, which is COVID. But when Time magazine did their top 10 reports, they are more worried about the direction of political leadership in China and what that does in terms of American and Chinese relationships. So they're worried about another sort of Putin effect coming through the leadership of China and what way that may go in the future. So yes, China is quite dramatic in terms of the way it opens and closes its economy based on COVID, and that does cause disruptions to supply chains And, where companies have got a lot of sourcing from China, that is immediately disruptive, and one needs to think about that. In the broader context, the geopolitical issue is the political decision-making and where that may have a knock-on effect in other or create instability in the regions.
Yeah, and South Africa has just ascended recently to the chairmanship of Brics, that bloc, which they are trying to increase and try to act as a counterweight of sorts between China and the West. As a risk analyst, when you advise clients, should they factor in the fact that South Africa has got very close, cozy relations with the likes of Russia and China?
Yeah, I think it's part of the environment. One just needs to understand how that plays out. So there are markets in the world now, including the insurance markets, where you cannot get insurance for Russian shareholder-dominated businesses. So if you then have a bank or a loan or a project or whatever it is that might be financed through Brics and Russian shareholding, one then would find it very difficult to get to insurance for that particular project. So one needs to look through some of the other knock-on effects of those kinds of issues.
Okay, so the geopolitical instability and the question of state collapse, let's call it that, the failure of infrastructure will be the two biggest ones for South Africa over the next decade. Risk-wise, the issue we are told all the time in this country of safety and security, for example, the high levels of crime, it doesn't feature this time around.
No, not directly that way. I think, again, socio stresses in the social environment are that theme, and the report did comment that last year their focus was on the greater divide and more distress in communities where the poor got poorer and so forth. So that element did come through post-COVID. So that's an ongoing theme that is being tracked in terms of the interconnectedness of risk. In our environment, I think a more practical issue would be our biggest risk is not executing on fixing the power. Because if we don't fix the power, we continue with low economic growth, and that continues to increase unemployment amongst other factors. And that delays confidence and investment in the economy. So getting the power and the infrastructure sorted out, and then that being a trigger to a renewed growth environment for the country, to me, would be the main strategic risks for the country. The more those things are delayed, the more the risk of social disturbances continue to rise.
So sort out the energy crisis. That's your single biggest risk into the future, because, as you said, it will affect many other areas. Now, in advising your businesses, for example, how do they mitigate this risk? What do you tell your clients, Volker?
Well, I think we have maybe been guilty to something like ostrich. We've been, as much as the mines have generated some of their own power, I think changing the power generation model within the context of time to moving the emphasis away from Eskom and moving it quickly to the high power needers. So let's say we had, instead of gas turbines only under Eskom, why couldn't we have gas turbines at an industrial node like Roslyn and Pretoria and Ukuruleni here and otherwise? So if you move the gas turbines there and it became a mutualized funded investment by an industrial club, they could get a gas turbine going in a year or two and supply themselves under a local billing arrangement. So you could put down 5 gas turbines around the country, generate 10,000 megawatts, and then the industrial centers would be fixed, and then the rest of the power could be used for the local population. Now, that change of the power generation model is a quick fix, and I'm not saying it's the perfect answer, but changing the model to distributing the fix into the areas that need the power, have the money, and will pay for the power because business is hurting, and they'd rather pay for the power and get their businesses running back at 100%.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible, but now the issue, as you said earlier, is the challenge of implementation. It looks like we're very good at planning and diagnosing the program and all of that, but when it comes to fixing, we are not able to. I mean, we've been with the problem of power cuts since the latter part of 2007. That's over 15 years ago, and still it's a big headache.
That's the point.
And it's becoming worse and worse. Thank you very much for your time and insights. That's Volker von Widdern. He's Riskonet Africa's Principal of Strategic Risk.